Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reforged podcast. My name is Drew, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. On today's episode, we're going to be starting a new series where we go through the book by Lee Strobel, Case for Christ. It's a book written by an author who was formerly an atheist and a skeptic who, after witnessing his wife become a Christian and experience the transformation in her life and in her character, was compelled to reconsider his thoughts on Christianity, and kind of he recounts in the book um, the in-depth exploration of Christianity that he took, digging into different aspects of the gospel and considering its legitimacy, its truth, and its value. And he is actually a Christian today. He pastors a church, and he does a lot of speaking, writes a lot of books. And so this Case for Christ book is a really influential book when used as a resource both to strengthen the legitimacy of our faith, and also to introduce faith in a really intentional and thorough way to those who are maybe new to the idea of Christianity. So I hope that this series is going to be really beneficial for you guys to listen to, and I'm certainly going to have a good time reading this book and sharing my thoughts and summarizing it. Today we're going to be looking at the introduction section of the book, some of the background about Lee Strobel, as well as the introduction to the book, how he introduces the way that he's approaching this consideration of Christianity. And then we're going to look at chapter 1, where he looks at the eyewitness testimony aspect of the Gospels, who they were written by, how we can be sure they were written by those people. So we'll look into that today as well. Before I start this episode, just a couple prayer requests in my personal life. I ask that you be praying for my dad. He injured his knee the other day, and so they're going to do an MRI in a couple days here and take a look at his knee, and just prayers that they're able to figure out what's wrong with the knee. He might have torn a ligament, and so if that's the case, I just pray that the MRI will show that, and they'll be able to schedule a quick treatment with a quick recovery process, and just that God's spirit and presence of healing and comfort will be over him during that time. I also pray, I have a friend who has a family member that's gone missing, and I just pray that you know that family member will be found, and be safe, and also pray for the law enforcement, the family, as they work to search for and find this family member. And I also pray, of course, for the family during this difficult time, that God's nearness and presence will be with them and give them hope and peace during a really dark and difficult time. So you'd be praying for those things. That would be great. If you have any prayer requests of your own, please leave them in the comments of the show. I make sure to check those, and I'd be happy to be praying for you. And I know that many of the people who listen to the show would be happy to be praying for you as well. There's power in prayers. But with that all out of the way, let's just jump right into today's passage. Of course, we're not in the Bible today, but we're in this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. I will link the Amazon page for the book if you would like to purchase a copy and read it along for yourself if you haven't already. And I recommend that you do. It's a really good, valuable book that goes into more depth than I am going to on this podcast. But let's get started with the introduction of the book. So Lee Strobel, the author, he used to be a editor for the Chicago Tribune. He used to be a reporter and editor for that paper. And so he would write different articles. Specifically, he would look at legal cases and report on them. And he describes a certain case in where all the evidence pointed to a criminal shooting and injuring a cop. And the evidence seemed to clearly suggest that. He was present at the trial, and he reported on it. And the criminal even confessed guilty to the crime, and so it seemed pretty closed. But then some new testimony came out that someone had seen the cop at a party, and they were showing off what's called a pen gun, and it's basically a 22 caliber pistol that looks like a fountain pen, but it really has a bullet in it, and it can shoot out. And it is illegal for anyone to be carrying those. And so because of that testimony, and then looking at the evidence again, the case was actually reopened, because when you re-examine the evidence, a lot of the things that they saw of like where he was shot and the ballistics of it and also just the situation, um, it became clear that what really happened is not that this criminal had actually shot this cop, but that the cop's pen gun had discharged in his pocket. And so um, the ruling ended up being overturned and changed. And Lee Strobel presented this as an example of how we may go in with an assumption or with different biases that when we look at the evidence, we think that the conclusion is clear, but really, if we look at it from a different lens, we can see how the evidence can be realigned and how maybe the conclusion that we initially came to isn't the one that we should be. And so in his personal life, as I mentioned, he was an atheist, he was a skeptic, um, and he was also uneducated on the Christian faith and on the Gospels. He didn't know what the claims of Jesus were, who he truly was, what he truly said. He just thought of him as a somewhat prophetic and significant figure who talked a lot about love and kindness and goodness. But he didn't think much of it. He didn't think too much about the legitimacy of an argument that there could be a God, a loving God. He didn't know that Christ claimed to be God and to be the Savior. He didn't know these things, and he learned in school from different professors in sort of a gloss over way who Jesus was that wasn't a full picture of who he really was. Um, this all started to change for Lee Strobel when he witnessed his wife come to faith in Christ. And he initially was he wasn't very fond of the idea of her being a Christian. He thought that that was going to um, change their marriage and relationship for the worse, and that was going to be um, very obnoxious and disingenuous to him. But instead, he witnessed a lot of character transformation within his wife that all was stemming from her faith and the gospel and the rest of the Bible that she was reading and the people she was spending time with at her church and the things she was doing. Um, and these were things that even he could recognize were very positive traits, very positive changes in character. And so this caused him to reconsider all the elements of the Christian faith and want to go take a deep dive into what the Christian faith has to offer and how it supports itself. I actually got to see at my church. Lee Strobel gave a sermon talking a little bit about his personal testimony and how that overlaps with reading the book. And I can include a link to that sermon as well because it was really cool to hear that side of it, his personal life, his personal convictions, and how that overlaps with the analysis of Christianity he was doing. But so essentially why he wrote this book was just to go through all the things he considered when coming to faith and how he came to his faith and wanting to share that, present that, lay that out for anyone else who might be questioning or might be a skeptic. And so today we're going to start with chapter 1, which is, of course, eyewitness testimony. And he starts this section by talking a little bit about what the importance of eyewitness testimony that he's observed in his own life. He talks about another court case that he reported on where there was a victim of a shooting, and two of his friends were actually murdered in the shooting, and this individual stood as a witness during the trial and said what he saw and claimed him, and he was actually in really fatal condition, ended up passing away shortly after the trial, which is really sad. But his testimony was able to really provide a clear, undeniable connection in this case, and it made the decision of the jury very clear. And so there is a great significance to eyewitness testimony. When someone sees something and tells you as it is, and it's clear that we can trust that they were there and that they're trustworthy, what they have to say is a very important anecdote. And so in this chapter, Lee Strobel talks to Dr. Craig Blomberg. He is a author, a professor, very, very high esteemed religious scholar. He wrote a book that Lee Strobel references called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. He has a doctorate in New Testament theology from Aberdeen University in Scotland. And currently, at the time of writing the book, he was a seminary professor as well. So he has a really good, solid background, which is important to Lee Strobel as he's writing this book. As it should be, he wants to talk to people who are experts who have spent countless hours going deep and studying these texts that he's asking questions about. But he talks with him, and in this chapter, it starts with their conversation about the idea of the Gospels being written by eyewitnesses. The first thing they talk about was the authors of the Gospel. So the four Gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as many of you probably know. We look at the first book, Matthew, being written by Matthew, also known as Levi. He was one of the 12 disciples. He was a tax collector prior to being called by Jesus. We look at John Mark, who wrote the Gospel of Mark. He was not a disciple of Christ, but he was a companion of Peter and Peter's ministry after Christ's death and resurrection. And then we have Luke, who Paul refers to as his great physician. He's a scholar and doctor who writes the book of Luke and writes the book of Acts as a sort of very I don't know what I'm looking for, but like as a very in-depth analysis of those. Now the question was raised by Lee Strobel, like how certain are we that these are the authors? There's really no contention in scholarly circles that these gospels were written by anyone other than these people. Dr. Blomberg talks about the records of early church testimony that specifies the authors of the gospel. That's how they put names to the gospels. He also brings up the point that they're kind of an unlikely group of characters. Mark and Luke are not members of the 12 disciples. They were not people who directly were themselves eyewitnesses to Christ. Also, Matthew was a tax collector. So other than Judas Iscariot, who obviously betrayed Christ and also took his own life afterwards, Matthew, with a background as a tax collector, he's probably not the ideal example of one of the disciples, just from a background standpoint. You look at some of the apocryphal gospels that were written afterwards, which are not considered part of the biblical canon, and they use names like Philip and Peter, and they look at some of the most notable apostles, disciples of Christ, and they put their name to those works, because that builds clout essentially. But in contrast, the authentic gospels that are part of the canon are not written by people that you would probably expect. Of course, John, the Gospel of John, is an exception to this. John was a member of the disciples, and not only that, but Jesus had the three inner disciples of James, Peter, and John, who were even closer with him than the rest of the disciples were. If we look at the book of John, there was evidence that most of the evidence points to the fact that it was John, the disciple of Christ, son of Zebedee, that was the author of the Gospel of John. There is a little bit contention because at one point it refers to a John, and it goes into this in the book a little bit. There's a John who was a church elder that may or may not also be John, the disciple of Christ, in terms of accounts of who wrote that gospel. But because of the other evidence, most scholars are comfortable saying that it was John, son of Zebedee, because, again, a majority of the evidence points to that being the case. There's one point of contention where it could be some other unknown John, but it also could be the same John, and so most people interpret that as the same John. That gospel also likely has an editor, because there are certain notes where the text seems to, not the actual content, but the writing style seems to deviate slightly from itself in some points, but that doesn't, from a scholarly standpoint, that doesn't seem to change anything about the legitimacy of John as the author, nor the content of his messaging there. The other thing is that the gospel refers to eyewitness material. So in Matthew's case, him being a disciple, he had eyewitness example. in Mark's case, he's writing from the perspective of Peter, not like in the first person perspective of Peter, but he's writing from what Peter has told him of the Gospels. And as we'll see later, Mark was actually the first gospel written, and that comes from Peter, who was a eyewitness. And then same with Luke. Both Matthew and Luke draw a lot from the Gospel of Mark, so they use the same sources and events. They've spoken to people who have had the same stories shared with them. And so while they themselves may not, as authors, always be themselves eyewitness sources, they're referring to eyewitness testimony, and there's significance to that. Also, there's outside sources that affirm that they were, in fact, the authors. There's different records, such as one of Pipus that was written in the year AD 125, which confirms the authorship of Mark and Matthew as the Gospels, and also Irenaeus in AD 180 speaks to all of the authorship of the Gospels. So moving on here in my notes. Lee Strobel also asked the question kind of why the biographies that of Jesus that are contained in the Gospels are so different. And Dr. Blomberg describes how there's kind of a literary and a theological reason, as he puts it, for that. For a literary reason at that time, in the Greek kind of culture, biographies and written history was not thorough or exact. They didn't see a benefit in preserving, excuse me, they didn't see a benefit in sharing like the full histories and preserving that for future generations. They didn't think of it that way. What they wanted to do is preserve the essence of what people said. They believed that you could learn a lot of lessons from history, particularly the experiences of people in history, and so there'd be a disproportional focus on what they thought could be considered and most beneficial to those who read it. So that's why the gospel is sort of stilted. It's not like, here's Christ's birth, here's his childhood, here's his latter years, here's his death. It doesn't go through that with equal focus and equal detail. It focuses on what's important, which connects with then the second idea, the theological approach to writing the Gospels. There's a focus on the life, the teaching, the death, and the resurrection of Christ, and that's because that connects to the theme that's trying to preach, the theme of great importance, which is that of forgiveness and atonement that comes from Christ, the importance of following Christ in the Christian religion. And so that's sort of why it's written in a different way. It's not that it's less legitimate because of that. And you'll also see that if you look at any kind of biographical writings that come from that age and period, it's going to be very similar. They're not going to be historically in depth. They're going to be briefer accounts that have a focus and a meaning, as did the Gospels. Lee Strobel also brought up this idea of what's called the Q hypothesis. And so Q is a title that refers to a hypothetical source, which is just a document with a list of sayings and information that both the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke share, but don't come from Mark. So as I mentioned before, Matthew and Luke pull a lot from Mark. There's a lot of cross-referencing there in terms of the stories and accounts that are shared and focused on. But certain teachings that do not come from Mark directly, theoretically come from a separate source because there are consistencies between Matthew and Luke. And the idea was that maybe these certain teachings are part of a separate document. It's not a complete document, doesn't come with a narrative. It's not like we're missing another gospel, but there may be some list of different sayings and teachings that Jesus had. In these teachings, if we look at like what sections would theoretically be part of this document, there's a lot of strong claims that Jesus makes of his character, that he is God, that he comes to perform miracles, he comes to bring judgment, he comes to bring mercy. Excuse me. Those claims are present in those teachings. And the question's also raised by Lee Strobel, like, if we just look at that source, kind of what picture of Jesus do we get? And that picture is very consistent with the gospel of Jesus. because um, a lot of the claims he makes in those teachings are central claims to the gospel, and we'll talk about later in John too. Like, it's very central to who Jesus is claiming to be. Um, Another point that was brought up in this section, it's sort of not related to Q, but kind of like, why would Matthew use Mark as a source? It makes sense that Luke would use Mark as a source for their gospel, because Luke did not have a firsthand account, but Matthew instead was a disciple, so he did have firsthand experience. And Dr. Blomberg raises the point that the reason that Matthew likely used elements of Mark in his gospel is because Mark was using Peter's testimony in his gospel, and Peter was part of that inner three. And so, while Matthew did have his own experience with Christ, he also wanted to defer to Peter, who was even closer to Christ, had even more experience with Christ than he did, so that his gospel would be thorough and complete. And so that's an interesting point he brings there. Now we get to the point where maybe some of you are thinking of this. Why exactly is John, so different? The Gospel of John is so different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We've been talking a lot about Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are referred to as the synoptic Gospels, the first three, because you can read them kind of like all next to each other and see a lot of connections and similarities, and it'll be very cohesive. And John isn't that way. John is very different. And the argument that some would bring is that John, because it's different, does that mean it's contradictory to the other Gospels? And the claim that Blomberg's going to make here is that no, it's not. It's just different. And so he raised the fact that while it is different, you can see similarities mainly taking place in the last week of Jesus. So from the time that he starts the Passover to his crucifixion. A lot of parallels there that you can observe when you read them side to side. Just the front half of those Gospels are very different. John takes a very Christological approach, as Dr. Blomberg refers to it, where he focuses on the claims that Jesus is making, that he's the way, the truth, and the life. He's focusing on Jesus being with God, Jesus being one with God, Jesus bringing the Spirit. He's focused very much on the character of Jesus and who he is in a, I don't want to say religious perspective, but, with him being God, while as the other Gospels, while certainly do not stray from the fact or gloss over the fact, the claims that Jesus makes of who he is and the fact that Jesus does die and raise from the dead, it's more of a historical source. It's trying to go through, here's who Jesus is, here's what he taught, here's what he said, and have that all laid out. Whereas John is, here's what he says, here's what that means, kind of. And while John has some distinction in some of the references he uses and the language he uses, they still actually parallel with those other Gospels. While John focuses heavily on the Christology, there's implicit Christology in the other Gospels. For example, Christ in the Synoptic Gospels refers to himself as I am, which is something that God says in the Old Testament. This is a connection there. There's also connections with John to the Old Testament, such as when John refers to Christ as the Son of Man. A lot of people think this is a reference to Christ being the Son of God, but also a man. But it's really actually referring to a passage in Daniel 7 where he sees a vision of the Son of Man being Christ coming down from heaven. And this actually is this is a godly claim. This is a claim that he is God. And most people miss that, which if you read the book, Dr. Blomberg expresses some frustration at that, which is sort of funny. But he explains kind of that idea further. Another point Lee Strobel ends up bringing up, because the gospel writers have the agenda of course, being proponents of Christianity, does that threaten the legitimacy of their messaging and what they say? And it's true, their theological motivations are very clear in the gospel. They want you to know of the history of Christ, and they want you to hear his claims of who he is, and they want you to believe and follow those. They were all Christians themselves. However, Dr. Blomberg raises the point that this does not mean that their works are biased or a flawed account. He says it's true that in history, sometimes as history is written by the victors, often history is misconstrued and reworded to to make a false claim, but that's not always the case. And he brings up this example, and he makes the claim that Christians, the reason that we can trust these gospel works is because Christians are actually the most invested in the pursuit of pursuing and preserving the truth that's been laid out for them. The reason they wrote these gospels is because they are personally invested, as they are Christians, in making sure that the gospels are accurately and correctly preserved and presented. He talked about the analogy of how with the Holocaust, there are many Jewish organizations that start museums and write books and collect Holocaust victim testimony. And that's because they want people to remember the Holocaust. They want them to believe that it was a real thing that happened. They want to learn from the past and not ever do that ever again. And their work isn't less legitimate because they're Jewish. It's just because they're Jewish, they have a very strong invested interest in this. So that's a point that he raised about kind of the legitimacy of the Gospels. And then the final big section that Lee focuses on in this chapter before taking an intermission in his conversation to continue later in chapter 2 is the dating of the gospel. Like, when were these documents written? How reliable are they as sources? Is it possible that some sort of telephone went on and these gospels came too late, that the mythology is flawed? And there are two ways of looking at it. Lee brings up a reference where the Gospels are dated in this way: that Mark was written in the year 70 AD, Matthew in 80, Luke in 90, as well as, no, sorry, I got that wrong. Mark was written in 70, Matthew and Luke were written in 80, and then John was written in 90. And so Dr. Blomberg talks about two things. He says, one, I think the gospel was written before that, but two, even if they were written at that point, so we're going to start by looking at that. He says that's still really reasonably within the lifespan of the eyewitnesses of the gospel. Christ's death is thought to be between 30 and 33 AD, and so at the point that Mark is written, and even Matthew, Luke, and John are written, it's still very reasonable to think these people are still alive at the time that they wrote these gospels, that they were distributed and found. The other point he brought up too is that any hostile witnesses to Christianity who would be, who are encouraged to not let any falsehoods be said about the gospel, who, if any lies or overreaches were made about the gospel writers, there'd be people to say it and claim it. And so there's still a strength to the legitimacy of that. Those are very near sources to the death of Christ. And then for context too, he points out that if we look at the biographies, the first biographies of Alexander the Great were written like over 400 years after his death, and yet they're still seen as legitimate sources. And there does then later on come a lot of mythology and false stories of Alexander the Great that make him to be a heroic figure and say things that aren't necessarily true, that didn't happen. But at this point of these biographies first written, still again over 400 years after his death, even those sources are still considered legitimate. And so how much more should we consider a source that was written a mere 40 to 50 years after as a legitimate? Then he talks about the idea, like a fresh gospel theory, where he thinks actually the gospels are much closer to the death of Christ than that even. He says that based on the writing of Acts and Paul's letters, we can put Acts at written about the year 62. And so because of that, Mark must become before Acts was written, and so Mark's probably around 60 AD. It's about 10 years before even that was said. And then Christ's death, as we said before, being 30 to 33 AD, that puts Mark's gospel only 30 years after Christ's death. So that first gospel was written only 30 years after Christ's death. And not only that, passed on to Paul. Um, Scholarly, we believe that Paul's conversion was in the year 32 AD and that he met with the apostles around 35. And so all these teachings that he had was coming from them. An initial faith in Christ, then, and those initial doctrines and creeds that we find in Paul's letters, those are almost immediate sources right after the death of Christ. Those are almost immediate sources from Christ. Because, as you mentioned, converts in 32, meets with these apostles in 35. If Christ's death is from 30 to 33, that's at minimum only a 2-year gap. So these are quite near a lot of the sorts of information we have. And so kind of the big conclusion of this chapter is that we can have confidence that in the authenticity and the legitimacy of the authorship of the Gospels, in when they were written, who they were written by, also the sources that they used. We can have confidence that it's sound eyewitness testimony. And it'll continue in the next coming chapters of different ideas of going further with this idea. But for this week, this is what we focused on. And so I'd encourage you to pick up this book and start reading along with the podcast as we do. It's been a pleasure reading it, taking notes, thinking about it, and talking about it with you guys, and sharing what I hope is at least an introductory or summarized version enough that it would inspire and encourage you to read this book for yourself. So again, I'll leave a link to the Amazon page in the description. I'll also see if I can find a list. There's study guide questions in the book. I'll see if I can upload those questions so you can be thinking about them. Even if you're not reading the book, just thinking about it after this. But yeah, there's a lot of great writing in the book itself, and a lot of great sources included in the references of that book. So I totally recommend checking it out. But thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it beneficial. I hope that your faith and your confidence in the writing of the Gospels and the legitimacy of what they say has been strengthened through this. And I'm excited to continue digging into this book with you guys. I hope you all have a blessed weekend. And remember, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another.